On a plantation where every breath was counted as property, one girl was taught to count something else: numbers, ledgers, columns, totals. While most enslaved people were deliberately kept illiterate, she was pulled from the fields and placed behind a desk, her chains replaced with ink-stained fingers and a sharpened quill. To the master, she was useful, invisible, a mind to be exploited quietly. But numbers have a dangerous habit. They remember everything. Day after day, she recorded shipments of cotton, barrels of sugar, purchases of tools and payments for people, names reduced to figures, lives flattened into profits and losses. What no one realized was that these books were more than accounts of wealth. They were confessions. Hidden inside the neat handwriting was proof of stolen labor, illegal sales, vanished children, and deaths that were never meant to be acknowledged. Years later, when those records resurfaced, they did what no courtroom testimony ever could. They spoke with brutal precision. They exposed the machinery of slavery from the inside and revealed how one enslaved girl, forced to balance the plantation's books, had unknowingly preserved the evidence that would finally tell the truth. On a sprawling plantation in the American South, life for enslaved people was governed by brutal routines, relentless labor, and constant surveillance. Children were born into bondage, and from the earliest age, they were taught that their bodies, their time, and even their thoughts belonged to someone else. In this harsh world, intelligence and curiosity were often suppressed because knowledge could be dangerous. Yet, amid this environment, one young girl displayed a sharpness that set her apart from her peers. Her mind was quick, her memory impeccable, and she had a natural aptitude for numbers, an ability to see patterns where others saw only confusion. In a society that considered enslaved people as property rather than human beings, such abilities did not go entirely unnoticed. Her unusual skill did not escape the master's attention. While most children of her age were assigned to labor in the fields or perform menial chores under the oppressive sun, she was pulled aside and given a task that few enslaved individuals ever received. Instead of a hoe or a broom, she was given ledgers, ink, and quills. She was moved to a small, quiet room within the main house where the master and his overseers conducted the plantation's financial affairs. Here, she was expected to track the harvests, record sales of goods, maintain accounts of tools and supplies, and occasionally document transactions involving other enslaved people. The decision to place her in this position was not a gesture of benevolence, it was calculated exploitation. A mind capable of precision and organization could increase profits, reduce errors, and ultimately serve the master's wealth-building ambitions. The girl's days became a blend of meticulous labor and constant observation. She learned to read numbers with exactitude, to calculate costs and profits, to recognize discrepancies, and to prepare summaries for the plantation owner. Her training was rigorous. Mistakes were met with reprimand, sometimes even with punishment. Yet, within this forced education, she found a form of power. Numbers, unlike words spoken aloud, did not betray emotion. They did not confess loyalty or fear. They were absolute, unyielding, and persistent. For the first time in her life, she wielded a tool that could, in a small way, define her own world. Despite being trusted with the plantation's records, she remained acutely aware of her precarious position. She was constantly reminded that her role was not one of equality or respect. It was a privilege granted by coercion, one that could be revoked at any moment. The overseers would walk by, scrutinizing her work to ensure that no errors had crept into the books. Every number she recorded had to align with shipments, sales, and inventories, and yet, every entry she made also documented the lives and labor of the enslaved individuals around her. She saw her peers counted as commodities, the birth of a child added to the tally, a sale removed a name, and death erased an entry. Through her work, she became intimately aware of the full scope of the plantation's operation, and the ledger became a mirror reflecting the dehumanization she and others endured daily. Over time, she developed a level of expertise that made her indispensable. The master came to rely on her calculations to make business decisions, to plan sales, and to justify expenditures. She could anticipate errors before they were discovered and propose adjustments that would increase profit margins. Her ability to read the subtle patterns of the plantation's economy meant that she held information that others did not. Information that, if she chose to share it, could expose discrepancies, corruption, or outright abuse. Yet, she had to navigate this power cautiously. Any sign of autonomy or resistance could provoke severe consequences, and she understood that her survival depended on the illusion of obedience and compliance. The social dynamics within the house were complex. Enslaved people around her treated her position with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Some envied her proximity to the master and the relative comfort she enjoyed, while others feared that she might be used as a tool against them, relaying information to the overseers. She carried the weight of these relationships, aware that her every action could affect not only her own life, but also the lives of those who worked in the fields and the quarters. She learned to communicate carefully, to observe silently, and to perform her tasks with precision without attracting unwanted attention. In this environment, mastery of numbers became more than a skill. It became a survival strategy. Her training also included exposure to literacy, an area deliberately denied to most enslaved people. She learned to read the headings of invoices, the small notes scribbled in margins, and the careful annotations made by her predecessors. Each ledger became a text, and she quickly realized that numbers alone were not sufficient. Understanding the context behind them was essential. By correlating shipments, labor schedules, and sales records, she could reconstruct patterns that revealed hidden truths about the plantation's operations. She began to comprehend the depth of exploitation in ways that others might never have seen, and her intellect allowed her to connect dots that exposed systemic abuses. Yet, even with these insights, she had little agency. Her work was constantly monitored, and she was compelled to maintain secrecy. Any misuse of the information she observed could endanger her and her family. Still, the knowledge she accumulated became an internal record of injustice, a private archive that she carried in her mind and through her meticulous writing. With every ledger she completed, she documented the reality of slavery in a way that was nearly invisible to those who held power, preserving the truth behind a facade of financial management. In her hands, numbers became both a weapon and a shield. They allowed her to protect herself while simultaneously revealing the hidden mechanisms of oppression. She began to understand the long-term value of her work, not just for the plantation, but for history itself. Every entry she made had the potential to bear witness to the exploitation and suffering that were otherwise ignored, erased, or forgotten. While she could not openly challenge her circumstances, she realized that her careful record-keeping might one day speak volumes beyond the walls of the plantation, offering evidence of wrongdoing that no one could easily dismiss. Her position as the plantation's accountant was a paradox. She was both enslaved and empowered, invisible and essential, oppressed and capable of documenting the very system that bound her. Every day, as she moved between ledgers and quills, she walked a fine line between survival and resistance. She understood that her intelligence, which had been turned into a tool for the master's profit, also contained the seeds of truth that could not be silenced. In this way, the enslaved girl's mind became a repository of knowledge, a record of lives lived under bondage, and a quiet testament to the human spirit's capacity to adapt, endure, and preserve evidence even under the harshest conditions. Her journey into accounting was not just a matter of learning mathematics or bookkeeping. It was an initiation into the inner workings of power, economy, and control. Each calculation, each entry, and each balance sheet revealed the interconnectedness of labor, commerce, and human suffering. She learned to see the plantation not merely as a physical space, but as a network of transactions, relationships, and hierarchies, all meticulously documented in the ledgers she maintained. In this sense, she became both a participant in and a witness to history, capturing details that no one else could record with the same precision. The skills she acquired went far beyond simple arithmetic. She learned to recognize irregularities that suggested mismanagement, theft, or even violence. She began to understand how the master leveraged information to maintain control and how the absence of accurate records could destabilize his authority. This knowledge gave her a subtle, internal power, allowing her to anticipate decisions, predict outcomes, and understand the broader implications of seemingly mundane entries. While outwardly compliant, she carried a mental map of the plantation's operations that made her uniquely aware of both opportunity and risk. Her life as the plantation's accountant became a blend of intellect and caution, insight and invisibility. She moved through the world of numbers with grace, documenting realities that were deliberately hidden from the public eye. Her ledger entries, though created under duress, would one day serve as irrefutable evidence of the lives and labor that slavery sought to erase. In this way, her enforced education, intended to exploit her talents for profit, inadvertently transformed her into a chronicler of truth, preserving the realities of bondage with a precision that no oral testimony could match. The plantation ledgers were deceptively ordinary at first glance rows of numbers, neatly aligned columns and headings indicating shipments, expenses, and sales. To anyone who had not been trained to read them, they might have appeared as nothing more than mundane financial records, the kind that could be found in any business of the era. But for the enslaved girl who maintained them, these ledgers were far more than mere documentation of profit and loss. They were a silent witness to the human cost of the plantation system. Every transaction recorded within those pages carried hidden significance. Every entry told a story that no one had intended to preserve, and every figure held evidence of lives reduced to numbers for convenience and control. As she meticulously entered data into the ledgers, she began to notice patterns that spoke to the realities of enslaved life. Shipments of cotton and sugar were often linked to payments made for tools and supplies, but other lines revealed purchases of human beings, names, ages, and sometimes familial relationships reduced to columns of figures. She recognized that when a name appeared under a sold heading, it signaled a separation, a forced relocation, and often a permanent loss of connection to loved ones. She became acutely aware that the ledger was more than an accounting tool. It was a map of human suffering, carefully maintained by the very system that sought to erase it from history. Beyond the obvious transactions, the ledgers contained subtler evidence of cruelty. Medical expenses recorded for injuries, treatments, and deaths were often disguised as incidental costs of operating the plantation, but she understood the true meaning behind them. Notes in the margins sometimes referenced punishments or accidents, and even without explicit detail, the cumulative weight of these entries told a story of relentless labor, violence, and neglect. Names that appeared suddenly disappeared from the records, and without the context she had internalized through observation. Such disappearances might have been meaningless to the casual reader, but for her, the ledgers chronicled the life cycle of enslavement, from acquisition to forced labor, and ultimately to death, a cycle sanitized for the master's convenience yet recorded with unintentional honesty on every page. The precision required in bookkeeping forced her to engage with the information in a way that left no detail overlooked. Quantities of harvested crops were compared to sales receipts. Expenditures for food, clothing, and tools were balanced against labor outputs. Shipments to distant markets were cross-referenced with incoming funds. In every reconciliation, there were traces of human labor behind each figure, hours spent in the scorching sun, aching backs bent over fields, exhausted hands picking cotton or tending livestock. The numbers were abstract, but she could see the lives they represented. She understood that each calculated profit was built on the physical and emotional suffering of the people whose work filled the columns of the ledger. Her awareness of these hidden truths grew with experience. She began to see connections between entries that were never meant to be apparent. Payments for overseers' supervision aligned with spikes in field output, suggesting forced intensification of labor. Purchases of supplies like whips, shackles, and chains were often recorded alongside accounts of medical treatment, hinting at injuries inflicted during punishment. Even seemingly benign expenditures, such as gifts of food or clothing to enslaved individuals, were contextualized within the broader system of control and surveillance. Through the careful cross-referencing of these entries, she pieced together the mechanisms of oppression, understanding how profit was inseparable from cruelty, and how every line in the ledger contributed to sustaining the plantation's economy of exploitation. The girl also discovered that some entries exposed outright illegal activity, sales conducted without proper documentation, trades of enslaved individuals circumventing local laws, and manipulation of weights and measures for commodities all appeared within the pages of the ledgers. To the master, these anomalies were minor errors or routine bookkeeping adjustments, but she saw them as a reflection of a system that operated with impunity, bending rules when convenient, and erasing accountability for the suffering it caused. Her intimate knowledge of these records made her aware that the ledger was not just a tool for profit, it was a repository of evidence that could reveal the hidden operations of the plantation to anyone who knew how to read it critically. The records also documented the economic rationale behind decisions that shaped the lives of the enslaved. Births and deaths, Acquisitions and sales, punishments and rewards each had a financial implication, and each was meticulously logged. She could trace how a child born into slavery became a future source of labor, how illness reduced productivity and increased costs, and how punishment and intimidation were calculated to maintain order and efficiency. The ledger reduced human experiences to financial metrics, yet it was precisely this reduction that allowed her to see the full extent of the exploitation. Numbers, which the master valued for their neutrality and clarity, inadvertently revealed the plantation's moral bankruptcy. Her work also brought her into indirect contact with broader markets. Shipments to ports, sales to distant buyers, and communications with merchants were recorded in ways that made the plantation's connection to a larger economic system explicit. Cotton, sugar, tobacco, these commodities, were tracked with meticulous care, but behind each shipment were human hands, often injured or exhausted, laboring under compulsion. She realized that the ledgers documented more than local operations. They were evidence of a network of complicity in which distant buyers profited from the enslavement of people they would never meet. The numbers on the page became a bridge between the microcosm of the plantation and the global economy built on forced labor. Despite the oppressive purpose of the ledgers, the girl's position allowed her a unique vantage point. She could observe how the system functioned internally, understanding patterns and correlations that others could not. She saw the inconsistencies that hinted at corruption or malfeasance, the hidden costs that the master tried to obscure, and the ways in which labor was exploited for maximum profit. Her daily engagement with the records sharpened her analytical skills and her ability to interpret data critically, and she began to recognize that the ledger was a document of power, both for those who controlled it and, inadvertently, for her as the one who understood it. Over time, she began to internalize the dual nature of the ledgers. They were tools of oppression, yet they were also repositories of truth. While intended to justify and facilitate exploitation, the records preserved an unfiltered account of human labor, suffering, and resilience. She realized that these numbers, when read carefully, could tell stories that words alone might never capture. The ledger was, in effect, a hidden archive of life under slavery, documenting details that the plantation's owners would have preferred to remain invisible. Her intimate knowledge of this hidden narrative gave her a sense of responsibility. She understood that even if she could not publicly challenge the system, the records themselves could eventually speak volumes, bearing witness to injustices that otherwise would have been erased. Her careful observation and record-keeping turned the ledgers into instruments of documentation that transcended their original purpose. While the master valued them for profit and efficiency, she recognized their deeper significance. Each entry was a testament to the realities of slavery, capturing the intersection of labor, violence, and economics with precision. She became aware that the seemingly mundane numbers had a life of their own, silently preserving evidence of exploitation and cruelty in ways that no oral account could replicate. The ledger, once a tool of control, became a repository of truth, revealing the human cost embedded in the plantation's operations. Through her engagement with the records, the enslaved girl developed a perspective that bridged the gap between the abstract world of numbers and the tangible reality of human suffering. She could trace the lineage of transactions, understand the implications of management decisions, and recognize the moral consequences embedded within financial calculations. Her work allowed her to see the plantation not merely as a site of labor, but as a carefully constructed system of economic and social control, sustained by meticulous record-keeping that documented both profit and oppression. In this way, the plantation ledgers became more than accounting tools. They were a window into the lives of the enslaved, a record of injustice and a hidden archive of resistance. While the master viewed the ledgers as instruments to maximize wealth, the girl understood that within their pages lay the potential to expose the truth, revealing the full scope of human suffering and the mechanisms of exploitation that were often concealed from view. Years after the plantation had long ceased operations, the very ledgers that had once been instruments of control became key pieces of evidence, revealing the brutal reality of life under slavery. The rediscovery of these meticulously maintained records offered a window into a world that had been systematically erased from public memory, a world in which every human being was reduced to a number, a line item, a profit or loss. Historians, scholars, and descendants of those enslaved began to study these documents with a mixture of awe and horror, recognizing the level of detail that had been preserved and the ways in which the records could finally give voice to those who had been silenced. What had once been a tool of exploitation now had the power to expose the truth, with an authority that words alone could never achieve. The ledgers revealed patterns that confirmed what oral histories and scattered personal accounts had long suggested. The plantation was a meticulously managed system of labor extraction, profit maximization, and human oppression. Every transaction, shipment, and tally in the account books was carefully aligned with labor schedules, the ages and abilities of enslaved individuals, and the economic needs of the master. The records allowed modern observers to trace the exploitation of people over years and decades, showing how every decision, from the allocation of tasks to the punishment of individuals, was calculated for maximum efficiency and profit. The data contained within these pages validated accounts of overwork, abuse, and the dehumanizing treatment of the enslaved, providing concrete evidence that corroborated stories previously dismissed as anecdotal. Beyond the economic details, the ledgers also documented the personal lives of those who had been enslaved. Often inadvertently, names recorded alongside ages, familial connections, or skills became fragments of identity that survived the attempt to erase them. Payments, fines, or notes of injuries revealed the ways in which enslaved people were punished, neglected, or even killed, details that were previously lost to history. The girl who had maintained these records had, often unknowingly, preserved these truths for posterity. By faithfully recording every transaction, she created an archive that bore witness to lives lived under oppression and allowed later generations to reconstruct the social and economic realities of the plantation. Historians examining the ledgers noted the stark contrast between the apparent orderliness of the numbers and the chaos and suffering they represented. Columns of cotton bales, barrels of sugar, or sums of money might appear neutral, almost clinical, but each figure corresponded to hours of grueling labor, exhaustion, injury, or death. Each entry was a reminder that the economic prosperity of the plantation, and by extension the wealth of the master, was built upon the systematic exploitation of human lives. The ledgers served as a reminder that accounting, often thought of as neutral and objective, can also document injustice with precision, capturing realities that might otherwise be invisible to history. In some instances, the records revealed particularly egregious examples of exploitation that had been unknown or undocumented elsewhere, instances of children being sold without consent, family separations, or unauthorized punishments appeared alongside standard economic transactions. Because the girl had maintained these ledgers with careful attention, even minor details survived, providing crucial context for understanding the human cost of slavery. Researchers could analyze patterns over time, such as the frequency of certain types of punishment or the correlation between crop yields and labor demands, and draw conclusions about how enslaved individuals were controlled, coerced, and dehumanized in ways that had previously been only partially understood. The rediscovery of the ledgers also had profound implications for the descendants of those enslaved. Names and details preserved within the records offered a connection to ancestors whose lives had been obscured by history. Families who had been separated or whose histories had been lost could begin to piece together their lineage, identify relatives, and reclaim aspects of their heritage. For many, the ledgers were more than historical documents. They were a bridge to the past, a tangible link to the people whose labor and suffering had been erased from public memory. The enslaved girl's meticulous work, though coerced and exploited at the time, became an unintentional act of preservation and resistance, giving later generations the means to understand and remember their history. Scholars also recognized that the ledgers provided a unique perspective on the internal workings of the plantation. While legal documents, personal diaries, and newspapers from the period often depicted a sanitized or incomplete version of plantation life, these records offered an unfiltered view of operations from the inside. Because the girl had been responsible for recording every detail, the ledgers captured both routine and extraordinary transactions, revealing the complexity and scale of the plantation economy. Researchers could study how labor was allocated, how resources were distributed, and how the master balanced profit with control, gaining insights into the systemic nature of slavery that would have been impossible to obtain from other sources. The records also challenged assumptions about the invisibility of enslaved people's contributions. While the girl herself had been coerced into performing accounting work, her position inadvertently ensured that she documented the activities of the plantation in exhaustive detail. She became the keeper of knowledge that, while intended to serve the master, ultimately preserved the truth for history. Her skill with numbers, combined with her proximity to critical information, meant that she held a level of insight that few others could attain. This insight, preserved in the ledgers, became invaluable in understanding the inner workings of the plantation and the lives of the people who labored within it. The ledgers, once purely functional, became a tool for historical accountability. Historians, using these records, could now provide evidence of practices that had previously been difficult to substantiate, such as illegal sales, neglect, and the systematic devaluation of human life. The meticulous nature of the entries meant that discrepancies, patterns of abuse, and economic strategies were laid bare with clarity. What had been intended as a mechanism for control and profit now served as proof of injustice, exposing the very system that had sought to erase its victims. In many ways, the ledgers demonstrated the duality of documentation. They were created for one purpose: to manage resources and maximize profits. But they also had the unintended effect of preserving the truth for future generations. The girl, in performing her forced labor with precision and diligence, had left behind a historical record that could not be denied. Each page, each entry, and each calculation contributed to a broader understanding of slavery, ensuring that the experiences of those who had been enslaved were neither forgotten nor obscured. The impact of these records extended beyond academic study. They influenced public understanding of history, informed museum exhibits, and provided critical evidence in legal and genealogical research. Descendants and communities could see the tangible proof of their ancestors' lives, hardships, and resilience. The ledger became more than a bookkeeping tool. It became a testament to endurance, a silent witness to truth, and a source of empowerment for those seeking to reclaim the stories of their forebears. Through the rediscovered accounts, the enslaved girl's work finally achieved a form of justice. Even if delayed, her labor, coerced and exploited at the time, became a vehicle for revealing the truth and ensuring that the human cost of slavery could not be hidden. The records transformed from instruments of oppression into powerful historical evidence, showing that even under the harshest conditions, the truth could be preserved, and one individual's diligence could illuminate the realities of an entire system. These ledgers demonstrated the profound power of documentation and the ways in which seemingly mundane records could carry extraordinary significance. They were not just numbers on a page. They were the voices of those who had been silenced, carefully preserved by the girl whose skill, intelligence, and meticulousness ensured that the plantation's history, its profits, its crimes, and its human toll would one day be known. In this way, the records transcended their original purpose, becoming an enduring testament to the lives of the enslaved, the injustices they endured, and the capacity of truth to survive even in the most constrained and oppressive circumstances. The story of the enslaved girl who became the plantation's accountant is a testament to the unexpected ways truth can endure. What was intended as a tool of exploitation, a ledger of numbers, profits, and losses, became a record of resilience, a witness to injustice, and a voice for the silenced. Her careful hands and sharp mind preserved lives and stories that the world had tried to erase, showing that even in the darkest circumstances, knowledge, diligence, and courage can leave a legacy that refuses to be hidden. The ledgers she kept remind us that history is often written in the margins, in the unnoticed labor of those who survived, and that truth, once recorded, cannot be entirely silenced. Through her, the silent echoes of the enslaved finally found a way to speak, and generations later, they demand to be heard.